Greetings all, Dr. Raphael X here with another video. Please click on the subscribe button, notifications button, all that good stuff. Leave a comment. And sorry about the lighting here in both, well, kind of, your lighting is not the best either, but mine is
Yeah,
pretty much, I have like a little thing here, but hopefully I'll get that fixed. And well, let's start with the sign of the cross as we always do to remember our baptism, right? In the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. All right. Well, thanks for joining us. And today we're going to talk about Fatima, Our Lady of Fatima, those apparitions, which are probably the most important Marian apparitions in the church, and the Eastern churches, the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church, how they view Fatima. Obviously, the Eastern Catholics have a more favorable light towards it than than the Orthodox churches. So, as we all know, hopefully you know, that in 1917 these apparitions begin of Our Lady of Fatima, who she predicted many things that were going to happen. She prophesied, well, the end of the war, the coming of the Second World War, the spreading of the errors of Russia, et cetera, et cetera. She showed the children hell, the miracle of the sun. So really, this was a tremendous apparition that really, in the hierarchy of apparitions, is one that cannot be denied. It's almost like it's a litmus test of Catholicity, I would say. Um, but really, in the East, they don't have as, I should say, the Orthodox, especially in the Russian Church, they don't have a favorable view. Again, especially the Russian Orthodox Church, they don't have a favor. I think in general, they don't have a favorable view, and maybe an Orthodox can correct me on this, leave it in the comments, towards apparitions because they kind of see it as superstition. Their whole epistemology is interesting too because they don't really believe in like natural theology, which is that we can know God through nature, kind of like that. Their epistemology is like directly supernatural, like there's a divine inspiration, or divine illumination, even in the natural knowledge. So the nature and supernature are not that clearly distinct, we can say. Not that they're necessarily separate, but we're saying clearly distinct in orthodoxy. We're not getting into epistemology, though it can have some overtones here. But it does seem like in orthodoxy, apparitions in general are not favorably viewed. So turning to Fatima, because Our Lady Fatima predicted the spreading of the errors of Russia, and in the end, this is especially here, the end, Russia will convert. This has kind of, especially the Russian Orthodox Church, which many can argue is the main church, at least the most powerful church politically, in the natural realm. It has this church up in arms, right? Because it's like, well, who is this Our Lady of Fatima to say that the Russia will convert? And obviously us as Catholics believe that it will become Catholic, convert to the Catholic faith. Some people have interpretation in that too. But also, even in the theology of Fatima, the theology that emits from Fatima, which we can get into also, which, for example, making reparation, right? Atonement. Atonement is the only English theological word that exists, actually, which is fascinating. Making atonement. These doctrines are not, I don't want to say they're rejected, but they're not clearly defined. Again, someone in Orthodoxy will correct me here. In Orthodoxy, which is kind of like we have a lot of kind of like the innate Ignatian view where do everything as it depends on you, knowing it depends on God, that God really, we are God's hands and eyes on this earth, the subjective redemption, the application of the merits of Christ through our sufferings, which are Christ's merits. So this is not that clear in Orthodoxy. This is really stressed in Fatima, and I think is one of the reasons they don't really like Fatima because of its theology of reparation. But this is what we're going to talk about today. So, Robert, I'm here joined by Robert, and thanks for coming on. Sorry with that long kind of intro there.
oh, no problem.
A super long video, but yeah, if you want to chime in here on kind of the Eastern's view, Orthodox or Catholic, especially the Orthodoxy, Russian Orthodoxy in particular, of Fatima. So if you want to chime in here, that'd be great.
Well, it's one of the things to say first, I guess, is there is something weird about, you know, I guess you could say apparitions in the East,
Mm.
because it's not necessarily that they are, you know, discouraged. It's because every time there's an apparition in the East, usually someone did something wrong, and it's sort of a punishment. So you kind
Okay.
of don't want that to happen. Like when usually, like they said, like we have a lot of cases of crying icons, an icon of the Blessed Virgin crying myrrh, or an icon producing myrrh, or icons doing miraculous healings and things. You know, there are Eucharistic miracles in the Eastern churches as well, and usually the Eucharistic miracles in the Orthodox churches and Eastern Catholic churches are a lot more hidden, because usually in order for there to be a Eucharistic miracle, someone in the area has to be doubting the real presence. And like one of the things I remember hearing from someone, they said with a Eucharistic miracle that like the attitude is almost like there was one miracle on the Carpathians where I believe it was a Greek Catholic miracle, from the Carpathian Church. In America, we would call that the Ruthenian Byzantine Catholic Church. Um, the priest doubted, and he went through the consecration and all that, and then when it got time for him to break the main host in the center, um, he broke it in half and blood spattered out,
Yeah.
and the attitude was, well, that's not supposed to happen.
It's like in
And so,
Lanciano, something similar happened. I believe the priest was also doubting, but yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
mhm. Oh yeah, yeah. So usually, and like if that priest is like a monk, or well, I mean, even if he's a parish priest, if the bishop finds out and that he was doubting, there's probably going to be some measure of penance that needs to be taken, because this guy, he was doubting, this happened, that's not supposed to happen. So someone did something wrong there. And with crying icons, I've heard even from a lot of people from Ukraine, just lay people, they tell me, they say, no, we don't want crying icons because that means something bad's going to happen. And they're right. Usually it means that there's going to be a major catastrophe of some sort. It's usually some sort of warning.
If I
And
could just chime in here, all of the apparitions have been warnings also. I mean, you see the approved church apparitions, La Salette, Our Lady of Good Counsel, Our Lady of Rwanda, who appeared angrily, right,
Mhm.
at the seer, what was her name? A young woman, and Our Lady of Akita. So
Mhm.
yeah, definitely not in the West also, but I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, it's definitely something to point out. And there are a few notable apparitions that aren't that are happening during or right after a major catastrophe.
Hmm.
And those apparitions have a much different. They'll usually carry the same message, almost like a "Don't do that again, or else there's going to be a worse catastrophe coming." Um, but usually they're more of a comforting apparition. So I believe Our Lady of Knock in Ireland, the Blessed Virgin, Saint Joseph, and Saint John the Evangelist, I believed appeared to a whole bunch of parishioners in Ireland. It
Yeah.
was totally silent, and it was at the time I think English persecution was ramping up, and they said that there was almost like a contemplative feel to it among the people who she appeared to. And another notable thing was that the priest wouldn't come to check it out. He was too lazy. So they had no one go to check it that was a cleric.
In that
Which,
apparition, I heard the people they when whoever the seer was when children went up to the apparition during this the seeing of the apparition, the Saint John, Saint Joseph, and Our Lady, they would when children would go up to them, they would be so happy. But when regular people go up to them, they would be horrified, just
yeah.
as a symbol of the reality, really showing the reality of the loss of innocence that people had. So this
Oh
is
yeah.
what told me so. But yeah,
And then another interesting one to point out. This one's not approved by the Latin Church hierarchy, But
Mm.
from what I understand, it is approved by the patriarch of the Ukrainian church and their bishops right after the Chernobyl meltdown, which, if you listen to Ukrainian sources, they believe it was a totally controlled meltdown, that the Soviet Union did it as a warning.
Oh,
And because at the time Ukraine was talking, there's always been a movement for independence in Ukraine, but it was beginning to become very strong again in the 80s, and so supposedly the KGB decided that they would melt down Chernobyl because it was somewhat close to the capital, hoping that the fallout would affect the capital and quell the rebellion. What ended up happening was, I believe it was the weather kind of sucked up all the fallout and spit it out in Belarus. So, and then it got actually pushed throughout Western Europe. They started finding radiation in the soils in like Sweden and England. And that was how they found out about the Chernobyl meltdown. Russia did not want it reported. They wanted it completely covered up. If it wasn't for the fallout in the Western nations, we wouldn't know about the Chernobyl meltdown. It would still be a classified document in the Soviet Union.
oh,
And about a year or so later, the Blessed Virgin appeared in Hrushiv. There was a series of apparitions in Hrushiv, starting in, and I might be saying it wrong because no one's ever actually told me how to say it correctly. In English, they spell it Hrushiv. Some people tell me Khrushchev, which sounds like it's Russian. Other people tell me Hrishu. That doesn't, it's not spelled that way in English, so I'm not sure if that's accurate. But apparently, the Blessed Virgin had appeared in the late 1800s to cure there was some sort of disease going around Europe at the time, and the Blessed Virgin appeared in the village to cure all the villagers. One of the things that's notable about Eastern apparitions is usually when the Blessed Virgin appears, she appears to everyone. The outsiders from the village will see her, government agents will see her, non believers will see her, everyone sees her. This also happened in Zaytun, Egypt. Everyone saw her there, including some Vatican informants who never specifically gave approval, but they basically like kind of nodded and said this seemed pretty legit. And it was a similar apparition where she was appearing, curing people, giving little messages to seers. So first in Ukraine, this happened in the late 1800s. She cured a disease, requested a chapel be built in the area, and essentially encouraged sticking to Orthodox tradition, we'll say, sticking to the legitimate traditions of the Byzantine Rite, um, discourage Latinization, which is adopting. It's like the way that best way I heard Latinization described is Latinization. It's not saying that the Latin church is bad or that their devotions are bad or that there's anything wrong with the Latin church. Latinization is like taking a Mustang and you're replacing Mustang parts with parts from a Hummer.
right. Yeah.
It'll take you down the street, it'll take you around the block, it'll take you, you could probably drive it and it'll be okay, but it's not going to work and eventually things are going to get burnt out and you're going to have to fix it. And that's essentially what Latinization is, where you're taking out legitimate pieces of the the tradition and replacing them with pieces of another tradition. And it actually happens between Eastern churches as well. And there are some cases, I think, where the Latin church will take Eastern things and they don't quite work out because the environment isn't quite suited to it.
Do
But
you think it applies to private revelations? Because I mean, Fatima was a Western revelation, so that's interesting what you mentioned there, which is true.
yeah,
I mean, mixing traditions can just become like a type of monster, we can say,
mhm.
if you will.
Well,
But yeah, I
well,
mean,
actually,
there's a saying. Yeah, go ahead, go ahead.
the thing that's interesting that you pointed out there about Our Lady of Fatima
Hmm.
is that the messages of Our Lady of Hrushiv are exactly the same as Our Lady of Fatima.
Mm.
They're exactly actually they're almost you could line up them with Akita and Fatima and you would get almost the whole picture.
And that's the Orthodox Church.
This is to well this is on you could say on Orthodox property. This is in Ukraine. She appeared technically to Greek Catholics, which would, they're Eastern Catholics, Ukrainians and Ruthenians, but there were Orthodox Christians there. And actually, there was a monk that my uncle knew. My uncle's a Ruthenian deacon. There was an Orthodox monk that I believe he heard saying, in reference to this apparition in Hrushiv, saying, "Oh yes, that's the Uniat miracle." That meaning that he believed it was legitimate, but it's Our Lady appearing to the Uniats, which is the Greek Catholics. Um, one of the
Let me
things,
just say, but the thing is, like, I think in general, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in general, the Orthodox Church, because they don't accept Fatima, is really, we can say there's a blanket statement. They really see in a negative light all apparitions. There's a saint that's called Diodocus, Saint Diodocus. It's an Eastern saint, Diodocus. I think I'm pronouncing his name right. There's a quote here, and he says, if light or some fiery form should be seen by one pursuing the spiritual way, he should not on any account accept such a vision. It is an obvious deceit of the enemy. Many indeed have had this experience, and in their ignorance have turned aside from the way of truth. We ourselves know, however, that so long as we dwell in this corruptible body, we are absent from the Lord. That is to say, we know that we cannot visibly see either God himself or any of his celestial wonders. So, my question, my issue here really is, it seems like their epistemology, um, because they're really against scholasticism. They're against this naturalist bent of where nature brings us to God, right? We know God's attributes in a natural way, through the analogy, right, with the creatures. They reject that. Again, there's this divine illumination, there's this direct connect with God that kind of bypasses nature. So really, the sense is God will not appear and appeal to our senses because God is totally right. They really focus on the transcendence of God. Um, he doesn't really obviously he incarnated, they believe that, but after that he doesn't really it's very supernaturalized, if you will. So it seems like their own theology is not open to uh the possibility of apparitions in general, and much less Fatima. I don't know if you wanted
yeah,
to,
yeah.
or if you wanted to
I'm
take.
not, I'm
Mhm.
not sure if I'd say so because you can find similar sayings from Padre Pio and John Vianney. They just go on to explain it, how you test the apparitions and things. I'm not familiar. I'm actually not so familiar with Saint, what was it, Theodokos?
Yeah,
I'm,
with a
I,
Diadochus.
okay. I recognize his name from the calendar. I've just never really quite looked into him that deeply. But you can find a lot of sayings from modern Western saints as well, usually in reference to, usually it's in reference to like an apparition that's too good to be true. It's like it appears to you, tells you everything you want to hear, and that's usually not a good sign. Because usually they'll, some of these apparitions, I would argue Medjugorje is a false apparition. It gives you pretty much everything you want to hear, but it starts out as a glass, glass 100% water, and then when they refill the glass for the next apparition, it's 100% water with one drop of poison in it. And then each time it appears, sometimes you'll get a full glass, sometimes you'll get a little more poison than you did last time. So you're slowly getting poisoned by these weird, statements. Like, for one thing, Our Lady of Medjugorje, you can't see her feet, which is in direct contradiction to any tradition concerning the Blessed Virgin. You can
Hmm.
always see her feet. The reason why is because her feet are meant to crush the head of the serpent, and the serpent can't mimic those feet. The Irish would say the demons can't hide their hooves. So that's one thing with, you know, to me, as someone who does, even though I'm Eastern Rite, I do adhere to my Irish heritage quite a bit. That's enough for me to say Medjugorje is not legitimate.
Yeah, even
Um,
Pope Francis denies it, saying that. I mean, there's too many. Usually,
yeah,
it's twice the apparitions. I mean,
yeah, yeah,
Pope Francis says she's not a mailman. I mean,
yeah.
literally
Oh
all
yeah. Well, I mean,
messages.
how many? how many days in a row has she been appearing since she first appeared? And like what that never happens. That just doesn't happen. You know, even Padre Pio, he wasn't constantly getting visions of the Blessed Virgin, from what I understand. And when if he did, they were all private. You know, that's it's not he's not out telling people these catastrophic things, and then also telling people that you can go to heaven no matter what religion you are, which is one of the errors of Medjugorje. Um, and the Blessed Virgin would never say something like that, and the Blessed Virgin, would never come out like personally insulting bishops, whether they accepted the apparition or not. You know, she might tell the seer, you'll have to weather the storm, but she's not
Right.
going to sit there and start personally insulting him.
All right.
Um, but with this Hrushiv apparition, it's almost exactly the same as Fatima, down to including the recitation of the Rosary. Now, some people would see that as a
There you go.
Latinization.
Yep, I was just gonna say that first Saturdays,
Hmm.
devotion to the Immaculate Heart of Mary.
Hmm. But there are things to remember.
Papal claims by
Oh yeah, yeah. Although that's
about the
in
Pope.
although in Eastern Catholic, I mean, of course, that's not seen as a Latinization by Eastern Catholics because, and even some Orthodox wouldn't see that because they do
Hmm.
acknowledge, the Pope is a legitimate patriarch and all that. But you look at the Rosary. The Rosary is one example. Now, I had a spiritual director at one point who was a he grew up Roman Catholic or Latin Catholic, and then he transferred jurisdictions to the Ruthenian Church. And he was very strict on, I think they call them something like Vostrochnik. I can't remember exactly how they say it because people, whenever they say it so quickly. I don't know. But there's two extremes. There's like Vostrochnik, which means like Orthodox, like very Orthodox, and then there's Latiniac, which means Latinizer. He was, very heavily in the camp of being, you know, more in some ways more Orthodox than the Orthodox. So, but he used to say the Rosary every day,
Hmm.
and he told me he said I won't allow public Rosary recitations in my church because we have our own services. We have the Malevolent to the Mother of God. We have the Acuthus to the Mother of God. But he said Latinization does not apply to devotional life. He said that you can pick up the rosary and say it every day, and there is an Eastern version of the rosary that was revealed to Seraphim of Sarov from Russia. Um, at some point after the Niconian Reform, the Blessed Virgin appeared to Saint Seraphim in a dream and essentially revealed the entire rosary to him. But it was actually more Eastern because the mysteries of the rosary all come from Eastern Rite feast days, um, including it starts with the nativity of the Mother of God when she was born, and then it goes to her entrance into the temple, and then the Annunciation, the Visitation, then the Nativity of Christ, and then I believe it's the flight into Egypt with Jesus and Joseph, and then it's the uh, presentation of Jesus in the temple, and then the 3 day loss of the child Jesus. Then it's the wedding feast at Canaan, and then it's the crucifixion of the Lord. Then it's exactly the same as the Latin Church. It's the resurrection, the ascension, the descent of the Holy Spirit, the dormition, and then the glory of the Mother of God. Her crowning by the Trinity after she was assumed. Um, so I mean, it's pretty much exactly the same thing, but with a little bit different of an emphasis. It actually focuses a little bit more on the Blessed Virgin than the Dominican Rosary because it goes from being very Mary centered to all of a sudden it's the Stations of the Cross, and then you're back to focusing on Mary again. Um,
Just focusing on that with Mary, also with the Immaculate Heart of Mary. That's very,
mhm,
Sacred Heart of Jesus. Even you as a Eastern Catholic, you
mhm,
don't have, I know who we're talking about this, you don't have devotion to, as you would say, body parts of the
mhm,
Lord or Our Lady. But so in the West, we do have a very strong, a sound, we can say, humanization
mhm,
of our religion. well, of Catholicism, I should say. So where we focus on the humanity of Christ, and especially in Spain, Saint Teresa of Avila, and then later on you have Saint Teresa Benedict of the Cross, who they're really focused on the physicality of our Lord, the devotion to Christ's humanity. So, and the heart being the universal symbol of love. There's a whole theology in the heart there. So that is a main issue. That is very Catholic. And I think because of that, the Orthodox cannot accept it, especially the Russian Orthodox. It seems like the official position, I'm not sure, maybe you can correct me. The official position is that these apparitions are not from God because
Mhm.
they're too Catholic. And
Oh
as you
yeah,
the Rosary and the Immaculate Heart of Mary, because that is really stressed here. First Saturdays are dedicated to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. I mean, that's a Western devotion which stems from Fatima. There's certain
Mhm.
you do five things, right? You go to mass, you go to confession, you meditate on the mystery of the Rosary, and so you do this in the first Saturdays. And this is definitely foreign to Orthodox uh, theology, we can say, and practice.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, actually, one of the things I would point out is that these things were missing from Latin devotion, but they were actually present in Eastern devotion.
Hmm.
Not specifically they don't specifically have devotion to the Immaculate Heart or the Sacred Heart, but they have devotion to what it symbolizes. So the Sacred Heart of Jesus is actually a much older devotion. In the Eastern Church is referred to Jesus, the lover of mankind. And so we end the Divine Liturgy by saying, For you love mankind, unless you use a new sort of liberal translation where they say, For you love us all. Um, but it's this lover of mankind devotion that is actually equivalent. And I believe there are some icons. I don't know how old they are, so they may be considered Latinized. But from what I understood, they're somewhat old, and I thought they outdated this apparition of Jesus, you know, to Mary Margaret Mary Alacoque. Um, Devotion icons showing the lover of mankind with his heart.
Hmm.
Um, Now the Immaculate Heart of Mary is an interesting one because I believe in that apparition of Our Lady in Ukraine. She actually made mention of something that's equivalent to that, where Ukraine was the first country, and I believe it wasn't at the time Ukraine, it was Rus, which is the kingdom that, the kingdom of Rus that sort of evolved into all of civilization for the Slavs. Um, she was first made queen there. She was given, they did a consecration of the country. The first one was that country where they made Mary queen of the country. And so essentially, I believe in this apparition, which she, instead of saying, consecrate, Rus to my Immaculate Heart, she just said, consecrate Rus to me. So that's not that big of a difference. But then also, the five first Saturdays is something that is missing from the Latin Rite in the Eastern churches and the early church, the early church, including the Latin Church. They used to have these things called All Souls Saturdays, and they led up to All Saints Sunday. So I believe there are five, if not more, All Souls Saturdays.
Hmm.
They're a Saturday, each Saturday during Lent is an All Souls Saturday. You go to church, you pray for the dead, you do parastas, you do panegyra, they hear confessions, you receive communion. It's a very ancient tradition in the church. Rome got rid of it when they got rid of it and replaced it with All Souls Day and All Saints Day, and they moved it to earlier or later, depending on which calendar you're using, into their liturgical calendar. Whereas in the East, they have these All Soul Saturdays that sort of build up. Then there's Palm Sunday, there's Easter, there's all of Easter, and then there might be one more All Soul Saturday, and then there is All Saints Sunday, which is the Sunday that follows Pentecost. So there's actually a very gradual buildup. You have a lot of time to go to confession. And notice confession's a big part of these days because they're during Lent. You have all this time to go to confession, all this time to get ready to receive the Eucharist. There's all this praying for the deceased. You're supposed to submit lists of your deceased family members for the priest to pray by name. Everyone in the church, they all every one of these All Soul Saturdays, the priest is up there praying for all these deceased people by name. The service takes forever, but it's a beautiful devotion, and it's one of the things I've noticed is that in the East these days are still pretty heavily attended. The people that have moved here from the East, as soon as they come to the West, suddenly they don't care anymore. And not everybody, but suddenly there's this drop in devotion. So it's something about the attitude that we've got going on over here with less religiosity, I guess. Not necessarily blaming the Latin Rite, but blaming Western culture
The
as
pro
a whole.
I've seen in the sense of the East, and this could be another discussion, is that they seem to have this binary, if you will, of the secular life. You have the secular life, and then you have your religious life. And it's funny because in certain aspects, there seems to be emergence of what you would call church and state, especially like Russian Orthodoxy. But in like day-to-day Orthodox Christians, they seem to be very much separated. I know of some Orthodox, and they don't like outside of their liturgies or outside of their services or even devotions. They don't you can't tell they're Orthodox by the way they act or the way they talk or the way it's strange. It's like again, I'm not trying to say this is all Orthodox, but it does seem that in their view, there's kind of like this dichotomy between the religious spiritual life and the natural secular life. But I
I
don't know.
wouldn't say that's exclusive to the Orthodox, though.
No, definitely, but no. I mean that's hypocrisy enshrined. We can say, well, Islam is kind of enshrined as taqiyya, they call it, dissimulation. Um, but no, yeah, that exists everywhere
Yeah, yeah.
on the
I
individual,
mean,
but it
one
does
of the
seem like it's
most
more. Yeah,
definitely one of the most guilty is the Russian Orthodox, and this definitely requires its own episode, probably with someone who knows a little bit more of it than I do. But the Russian Orthodox Church has had several major disruptions in its spiritual life, specifically the Russians or the Muscovites, as if you want to be more exact and use a much older term for what we now call Russian. Um, the first major one I would argue is the Nikonian reform, where they started killing people for doing the sign of the cross this way. Um, and it had to do with the state saying, well, we need conformity. Um, and it also had to do with the creation or recognition of the Muscovite patriarch, the patriarch of Moscow, the elevation of that metropolitan to patriarch. Um, then there were a few times where they suppressed the patriarch. It ended up coming back at some point. I don't remember because I think this happened a few times. I haven't studied it too well. But then when you get to the early 20th century, they end up with a patriarch named Tikhon. Now, Tikhon was actually, I believe, metropolitan in the United States for a while. And Tikhon actually was very friendly with a number of Byzantine Catholics. He was very friendly with the Anglicans. He actually did the Anglican ordinariate before the Roman Church ever thought about it. He started welcoming Anglicans into Orthodoxy, took their liturgy, scrubbed out whatever was, heretical, and put in whatever was Orthodox. I believe they tried to go to the oldest versions of the Anglican liturgy to pull from that, to make it sound within the tradition. Um, but he was very open minded, and when the Soviet Union decided to start suppressing the Orthodox Church, Tikhon started talking to some of his Byzantine Catholic friends about bringing all of Russian Orthodoxy, with him as the patriarch, bringing all of Russian Orthodoxy into union with Rome. And then they killed him. The Soviet Union killed him because that could not happen. Um, and he was quite friendly with the head of the Ukrainian Catholic Church at the time, who was Andrei Sheptitsky. He was pretty friendly with his brother Clement. I believe he had some communications with Theodore Ramja, who was essentially the head of the Carpatho-Rusin Byzantine Catholic Church, um, who was also number one on Khrushchev's hit list because he was so young and influential at the time. Um, so it was interesting where you see um, these major disruptions in the spiritual life of the entire Russian Orthodox Church. They get a patriarch, they start killing people for doing the sign of the cross with two fingers, then they get rid of the patriarch. Then, time comes later, they get a patriarch who's talking about union with Rome, and then they get rid of the patriarch. And then they bring back another one, and this one is now a KGB agent. And, that's pretty convenient because now he's just a puppet. And according to some Greek Catholics, he was not even a legitimate bishop. He was just a guy that they took off the street, and Stalin said, "Okay, you're a bishop now," which actually brings up a whole bunch of questions about, valid sacraments, valid appointments of other bishops. There's a question there. There's actually a pretty major issue there that it's going to need to be resolved at some point. And I've talked to some people about it. Their answer is ignore it and maybe it'll go away, and that's not how that works.
Right,
Um,
right, right.
but
No, I
it,
mean
it
that's I mean it's there's really a whole history behind it, and it's really fascinating. I mean, you see it by the effects, but it does seem like Fatima in particular is really honed in on um again, as we mentioned, Catholic practices. I mean, Our Lady repeats pray the Rosary every day in every apparition. The reason for coming is to establish universal um really devotion to her Immaculate Heart, which again, not accepted by the Orthodox. This notion of human works too in Orthodox, it seems like it's less valued than in Catholicism. We talk about merit too, which some get, especially in the Protestants, they get scandalized. Orthodox, I'm not sure. The notion of supernatural merit that we can merit, obviously in virtue of grace, eternal life. That is really stressed here with this theology of reparation. Our Lady is, and the consolation of God. This is a huge message in Fatima. This is one that Francisco was, this is what appealed to him more. Jacinta wanted to save souls from hell. Francisco he wanted to console God. So this is something in Orthodoxy, I'm not sure it exists, where God is um, somewhat, jokingly say a kind of an insecure God, which is not. I mean, it may seem so on the surface, but it's not the case. God has just tied redemption so closely to us, and we are so, united in Christ, his mystical body. We are the spiritualized Christ that he suffers. He continues to suffer in his members, even though in his head he is glorious in heaven. I think this kind of orthodoxy seems to be very abstract, deep, deep, yes, but very abstract in theology regarding the in reparation and atonement. That it kind of just it outright rejects Fatima because of this view. Also, what are your thoughts on that?
I think again a lot of this stuff, like as with everything with Orthodoxy, they lack unity. So it's stuff that you will see different depending on which community you talk to. Even among the Greeks, there's all sorts of Greeks that are fighting over their own patriarch right now because their patriarch is somewhat liberal. So you've got Mount Athos has declared him a heretic and says that they've excommunicated him. And they've also excommunicated the patriarch of Russia. So they're just kind of their own thing right now in Mount Athos. But certain parts of Orthodoxy, especially if you read older, older sayings of Orthodoxy, older texts of Orthodoxy, nothing from Our Lady of Fatima would be, um, none of it would be scandalous. You got to really focus on who you're hearing the criticisms come from. When they come from the Russian Orthodox Church, you have to remember they're KGB agents. They don't want anything from Our Lady touching their state-operated church. They don't want any of that. They don't want to lose what they've got functioning right now. Right now, it's working. People are listening to us. They're not, the young people don't go to church. They go to slave away in a factory. If they live to get old, then they go to church. That was the Soviet apparatus, although it wasn't necessarily adhered to, because there were decent numbers of people going to secret services in the forests. Um, there were actually Orthodox priests who used to be Greek Catholic. They broke union with Rome when the state forced them to, and then secretly went back into union with Rome through Greek Catholic bishops, and they started functioning dual parishes, where they would have their surface parish, which was Orthodox. All the old people would be there. They wouldn't do anything scandalous, but the people that were in the know would find that priest later in a forest, or he would show up at their house and hear confessions, real confessions, ones that weren't being leaked to the KGB. So there was a very complicated atmosphere in Orthodoxy, especially in Eastern Europe at that time. Some of the things you hear from the Greeks are actually very modern and very Protestant, because they've had some decent dialogue with the Protestants, which was actually the Greek Orthodoxy's openness to the West is one of the things that the old believers will tell you makes them heretics, because they're not maintaining the old way, which in some ways is true. I mean, when you start, I mean, there are some Greek Orthodox priests and bishops that essentially hold no, what do they call it, sola scriptura, which that's just doesn't make any sense in an Orthodox setting. But they'll say that just because the Catholics don't believe it. And then you have you can find all sorts of old Orthodox prayer books, and not old believers. I mean old, just old general Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, Coptic Orthodox prayer books that call the Blessed Virgin Immaculate. They refer to her being born without sin. Once Rome made that declaration, suddenly they scrubbed it from the books. All
Wow.
their new prayer books, they use other words instead of immaculate. Meanwhile, the church fathers, like I mean, all pure means immaculate. So they can't scrub the essence of the words. They just change the words because, it's a political game. But if you go by the Eastern Fathers, nothing that the Eastern Fathers said was contradicted by Fatima. And actually, there are things in Fatima that were not really, they're not Western. There's actually aspects of Fatima that are Eastern. For one thing, there was an apparition of the angel before the Blessed Virgin appears, where the angel gives Jacinta and Francesco, who were too young to receive the host. According to Latin canon law, you're not allowed to receive communion until you're a certain age. And I
Right.
don't remember, the age varies. It does vary jurisdiction by jurisdiction within the Latin Church. Now, Lucia received a host from this angel. Jacinta and Francesco did not. They were allowed to drink from the chalice, which is an Eastern practice. We commune anyone who's been baptized and is in a state of grace. There's nothing at the time that was in the Latin canon law that forbade them from receiving the chalice, which is an Eastern practice. So I remember there was a biritual priest who said, the Blessed Virgin is a genius in canon law, and she knows all of the jurisdictions of the church. So she's going to implore whatever tradition she needs to get the point across. Another thing about the Blessed Virgin at Fatima was that, the famous statue of her is wearing white,
Hmm.
white and silver. That's actually an Eastern practice. We wear white and silver. And actually, there were other apparitions of the Blessed Virgin during Fatima where she was wearing blue as well, light blue, dark blue. In our tradition, when we're celebrating the Blessed Virgin, we wear any shade of blue, and we wear white and silver. And if we don't have any blue, we wear white and silver. And if we don't have any white and silver, we wear blue. So that's another thing. That's sort of an external that's pulled from the East that you don't see so much in the West. Like, how many apparitions of the Blessed Virgin in the West do you see her wearing this bright silvery white? There's a few,
Right.
but a lot of them sort of make reference to an eventual unity of the churches.
Yeah,
Um,
that's really beautiful. I just want to say with Saint Pius the Tenth was the one who lowered it, and he died right before. So he died before the apparitions of Fatima, because I believe it was Benedict the 15th who was Pope. And so Pius X lowered the age to about age 7, age of reason, in that
Mhm.
decree, which was what did I have here? Quam singulari, singulari. So he changed the first communion because he was 7 years old. So technically, in the Western Rite, they could receive um, communion. And what's interesting though, I thought in the East, and correct me if I'm wrong, you have to receive under both species. Now, I don't think you use that terminology. It's more
No,
scholastic terminology. But in the West, you receive the totality of Christ in one of the species, under the species of wine or the species of bread, which are the accidents, of course, um, but not the substance. But you receive the totality of Christ. So in the East,
actually,
Mhm.
according to Eastern theology, you receive the totality of Christ, you know,
Liz.
in either, but
Okay.
the more often than not, you receive both. But there are actually a lot of notable exceptions where people will receive one or the other.
That's
And a
why,
lot
because
of
I haven't
things,
seen it. I thought that the theology was you have to receive. It's not just a symbolic, like in Roman, in the West, it's a symbolic gesture in the First Communion or in other special days you would receive under both species.
mm,
uh,
mhm.
but not normally, especially in the traditional rite. Now in the Novus
Yeah,
Ordo,
yeah,
they kind of want to, everyone to, but not after COVID. After COVID, they kind of scrapped drinking from the chalice. But I
yeah,
thought because all the Eastern rites I've seen, they always have the the under the Blessed Sacrament under the species of bread mixed with the species of wine together. I've never seen it separate. So interesting
oh,
that you do
I've seen
believe.
it separate,
Interesting. Okay.
especially especially when infants receive. A lot of times, priests will just give them a little bit of what's in the chalice without a host, and I've
Right.
seen a few people receive just the host without being in the chalice because they're alcoholics, and so they're trying to stay away from the
Okay.
accidents,
Sorry.
and
Yeah.
so the priest will
Yeah.
set aside
Right.
what they need.
Right.
Um, and then also people who have like gluten intolerances.
Right.
I've seen them have a special chalice set aside for them. Um, so it's in Orthodoxy, you'll hear a lot of very strong language, and it's true of the Eastern Rite Catholic churches too. But especially Orthodoxy, you'll hear very strong language like, "Oh, you have to receive both." But
Right.
then you talk to the parish priest, and he's like, "Oh, okay, you can't have both. Okay, just have one."
Okay.
They call it economia. It's um, it's essentially it's essentially breaking a discipline to maintain the law of the church. So
Right.
there was
Right.
a case, a famous case of economia. There was an Eastern Rite priest who was married, and he had, I believe, three or four children, all very, very young, and his wife died. And normally he would be made to be celibate, but the bishop made an exception and ordered him to be remarried because he said you can't take care of these kids on your own.
Right. Right.
So the discipline is that you do not marry after you're made a deacon. But there's nothing in the law of the church. Jesus never specified that, and there's nothing specified by the fathers or the
Right.
apostles. Or, I mean, some of these things are just even within the Latin church, you do see even in older times, they didn't call it economia because that's Orthodox, but they had little bits of economia that would slip in.
There's something
One of the
called in morality, it's called I think it's a Latin word. It's escaping me now, where there's an exception to the law where it's allowed.
Mhm.
Can't remember the word, but there's something similar that we have in the West. But yeah, no, this is great. I think we can continue and do a part two on this because there's a lot to talk about.
Yeah. Well, we
Uh,
still have to talk about the specifics of the consecration of Russia
yes, we
and
definitely
what that will look like,
yes,
because that's a big thing that has a lot of people confused. And there's certain people who are very close to the apparition that said that the conversion of Russia will be the Orthodox coming into union with Rome through the already existing Greek Catholic churches.
Right, and I've even read that a Russian Orthodox priest said the original wording was conversion of the world, which I think is absurd because the accounts say that the children thought Russia was a woman. They didn't even
Yeah.
know it was a country, so they
Oh yeah.
thought
Yeah.
Russia was a woman. So we definitely have to kind of clarify that to the best of our ability. Yeah, we'll definitely. But in general, I think we can kind of conclude that that orthodoxy, especially Russian Orthodoxy, well, it's clear that they reject the Fatima message. They don't include themselves in the conversion because it does mostly mean, at least in general, it means that them converting to Catholicism. I mean, that's what it means for us Catholics. Um, and obviously, they see that in a negative light. So, and all these other factors that we talked about, why it would cause them to reject Fatima. So we'll leave it at that, but we'll definitely have a part two. Thank you very much, Robert. And until next time, God bless, brother.
Thank you.
All right.